good afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I'm David Sloan. I'm a professor in the Price School. I am pleased to welcome you to the latest installment of the George Washington Lecture Series, which was launched 6 years ago. The series is a partnership between the Price School and the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. The series explores President Washington's legacy of leadership. This collaboration was made possible by the generous support of Mary Beth and Hale Borthwick. Mary Beth is a distinguished USC alumna and serves as the Vice Regent for California in the Mount Vernon's Ladies Association. We cannot thank the two of them enough for their generous support of this series. Today, we're going to discuss the complex relationship of the United States and the world, a topic that has been debated literally since the founding of our nation. As an example, President Washington's proclamation of neutrality in response to the French Revolution came after great debate and disagreement among his advisors. That debate between intervention and neutrality has remained in a tension in American foreign policy ever since. How should we respond, for example, to military coups, political imprisonments, and the repression of women's rights and free speech? How do we act as a leader in the world now, even as the world begins to have doubts about how we act at home, especially after the insurrection on January 6th? With those big questions in mind, I am pleased to introduce Kevin Butterfield, the Executive Director of the Fred W. Smith National Library. If you want to know more about him or any of our speakers, just scan that really nice program through the element on the screen right now. Kevin is a specialist in the founding era. He has a long list of publications, including a prize-winning book about early America legal and civil society. He has also been a wonderful partner for this series. And along with Doug Bradburn, they have worked beautifully with our US team to bring events like this one to you. We thank them for their generous collegiality. Kevin?
Thank you, David. This is a wonderful partnership. I could not agree more. And I want to thank the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, particularly the Vice Regent from California, Mary Beth Borthwick, whom you mentioned, for their support for this program and many others like it. So I'm joined tonight by Professor Abby Mullen from George Mason University, because we wanted to lay the framework for the conversation that we'll have over the course of the rest of the evening about the place of the United States in the world today by taking a brief look at the place of the United States in the world many, many years ago, that is in the time of George Washington. So Abby, I wonder if you could help us to understand what the first generation of American citizens would have seen when they looked outside of their own borders shortly after independence, shortly after they've established the new United States.
Yeah, the world that the United States found itself in or occupying was in some ways both bigger and smaller than the world that it had been a part of as the part of the British Empire. And the United States now had to figure out how to make its way in the world, both without the help of the British Empire, which was a considerable loss in some ways, but also without the strictures of being a part of the empire, which was a considerable freedom. So they kind of had a little bit of pros and cons there, perhaps. And they now got to occupy the useful, but sometimes dangerous position of being a neutral. And for Washington, this is really important. In fact, he makes an actual proclamation, which we now call the Neutrality Proclamation, in which he says that the United States is not going to get involved in the major wars that are going on in Europe. And so there is a lot of turmoil going on in the world that the United States finds itself in, and Washington doesn't want to see the United States get involved. But the United States also wants to get out into the world. They want to travel, they want to trade. And so the government that Washington is in charge of has to figure out how to make that happen. So when we think about sort of the compass of how the United States is relating to everyone else in the world, if we look north, There's all of these continued border disputes with Canada or with the British Empire about Canada. And those really don't get fully resolved for decades after Washington. Most prominently, we were thinking about the War of 1812, but even into the 1840s and 50s. And then if we look east, the United States is already heading to China before Washington, even during the Articles of Confederation period. They're looking to trade in the East Indies, in China, and all of these places that they have been going as British citizens or British subjects. Well, they want to go there now as Americans as well. And then if we look south, the Caribbean is an incredibly important part of the American economic system for a lot of reasons, including slavery, both coming to the United States and also the movement of goods that come out of those slave economies. So that's a really important piece of what's going on in the United States. And then, of course, when we look west, that's really where continental expansion is happening. And there are a tremendous number of native peoples who are in the way if continental expansion, which is part of the Republican ideal, is going to happen. So it's a big, big world, but there's also a lot of barriers in the way to actually accessing that big, big world.
I heard you mention goods and economic exchange a couple of times in that answer. And it strikes me when I read Washington, I see a lot of attention to free trade among all nations. Was that a priority for the American founders, or what else would you say were their priorities as they shaped an actual foreign policy?
Yeah, I think commerce and free trade is an incredibly important part of Washington's ideals and the other founders. Commerce is really important, even though there are many founders who aren't totally sure whether commerce, and in particular their trade in luxury goods, is really in line with Republican ideals. So there is the tension, but also there's a recognition that with such an economy that they already have built into sort of how the colonies had worked and now how the United States is going to work, you have to trade those goods somewhere. So the bottom line is that commerce is happening, whether the Republican ideals really fit with that or not. And so the first foreign policy objective is to make sure that those commercial interests are protected. And so that leads to two main ways in which the United States initially engages with the world, and that's through the consular service and through the Navy. So there's the diplomatic side and then there's the military side, but both of those working in service of making sure that American commerce can be free to go wherever it wants within some restrictions, and that the Americans are treated as they believe they should be treated.
One of the things that we come back to so often at Mount Vernon and in talking about Washington to various audiences are his final words as president, his farewell address, September of 1796, which it turns out we're now in the 225th anniversary year of that address. He gives famous advice there, particularly about the United States not becoming too involved abroad and becoming too attached to particular nations. I wonder if you could say a word about how that advice and how that carried into Washington's immediate successors' administrations, and at what point in the 19th century do you see his advice beginning to be disregarded? I don't know if you can help us bring us closer to the present by looking at Washington's advice.
Yeah. So to my point of view as a historian of the early American Navy and early American diplomacy through the consular service, I think that Washington's farewell address and his admonition against entangling alliances was completely impossible while he was actually saying it. Because in 1796, the United States is already embroiled in the conflict that would become known as the Quasi-War with France, which was all about the fact that they already had an entangling alliance with France, which there was a dispute between France and the United States about whether the agreement they had made during the Revolution was actually still binding now that the French government was no longer the government that was in charge during the Revolution, but this new Republican government and the United States reneged on the agreement, basically. And so even in 1796, when Washington is making these statements, which are important, the American commerce is being attacked by French privateers in the Caribbean and throughout the Atlantic because of this entangling alliance. And moving forward, we see things like the Jay Treaty and other things. So really straight out of the gate, entangling alliances are there, whether you want them to be or not. And on a high level, sort of the state to state conversations, there's not a lot of treaties, but I would argue that ad hoc alliances are a critical piece of the United States foreign intervention elsewhere in the world. So I studied the First Barbary War. Ad hoc alliances with countries like Sweden are incredibly important to that particular fight, and Sweden and Denmark and many other countries. So they're not official alliances as in there was no treaty, but they're no less important because they make it possible for the United States to even be in the Mediterranean. And of course, alliances also develop in the United States expansion across the continent because Native people are, as I mentioned, kind of in the way sometimes. And the United States takes advantage of the sort of squabbles between nations, between Native nations, and allies themselves with one group against another, and then just as quickly drops the first. So there are alliances occurring there as well. And then in the decades after Washington, they sort of formalize some of these contradictions, really, in things like the Monroe Doctrine. The United States wants to be known as a major power in the Western Hemisphere. They want to kick out potential European allies from the Western Hemisphere. And so sometimes they ally with surprising people in order to make that happen. So I'll just share one little consular anecdote, and that is in the 1830s, Joel Poinsett, who becomes more famous as the minister to Mexico a little bit later. So this is I said 1830s. I meant 1813. He is the consul general to South America, right as these South American countries are trying to break away from the Spanish Empire. And so when he arrives in Chile, he actually makes friends with some of the revolutionaries, and he hosts them in his house to help them write a constitution for the country of Chile. It doesn't work. It's a failed revolution at the end of the day, but he also ends up, while he's still an American consul, joining the Chilean army to fight against the royalists who are in Peru and Chile. And so he is like a great example of how the Monroe Doctrine can really push you into strange places while also technically avoiding entangling alliances. And we can see this all the way up to the 20th century, where the United States officially asserts its dominance in the Western Hemisphere with the Roosevelt Corollary and moves into outright imperial actions. So was it a good idea to try to avoid entangling alliances? Absolutely. Did they actually do it? Maybe not.
Thank you for giving us this founding era framework to better understand our place in the world today as we transition into this next conversation with Dr. Richard Haass. Let me ask you one more thing. If people are interested in early American diplomacy and foreign policy, I think you have a podcast where people maybe can learn more. What could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I do. It's called Consolation Prize, and it's a podcast about the history of the United States in the world through the eyes of its consuls. So it's about the lowest level of diplomatic actions. We talk about Joel Poinsett in a small episode, but all of these consuls are incredibly important to American diplomacy. And so that's why we're trying to tell their stories. So Consolation Prize, and you can find it anywhere you get your podcasts.
Thank you, Professor Mullen. I'll hand things back to Dr. David Sloan for the rest of the evening's conversation. Dr. Sloan?
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Abby. That was great. Really great stuff. Richard, welcome to our conversation. We are very pleased to have you here. I have been enjoying Richard's new book, which I encourage you to get, coming out in paperback in a reasonable period of time, called The World, A Brief Introduction. And we're going to pick up some themes from that. But I wonder if we could start with that bridge, entangling alliances. Obviously, President Trump had a particular view on our entangling alliances, and it's pretty clear that President Biden disagrees with President Trump's position. And I was curious, is this one area where you're going to see a dramatic difference between the two administrations?
Well, thank you, David, and thank you all for having me. I'll get to your question. Give me 1 minute, because something that Professor Mullen was talking about struck a chord with me. I was thinking about then and now. There's an interesting parallel and a fundamental difference between foreign policy in the time of Washington and foreign policy in the time, say, of Biden. The similarity, it seems to me, is then and now there was a desire to focus on the home front. Washington was the president of a new country, so much to be done. He saw the world as a distraction for the most part. The new world rejected the old in many ways. The purpose of commerce was not the 19th century idea of commerce to create a web of connections that would reduce the chance of war. It was more to fuel this new country. It was markets were good. So then and now for a President Biden, given COVID, given the millions out of work, given race issues, given infrastructure issues, public education issues, again, there's a desire to focus on the home front, on what we traditionally think of as things domestic. The difference will be, though, now, unlike then, is you don't have the luxury of turning away from the world. There's no pause button in history. The world will not let this country now, 250 years later, sort itself out and then welcome us back when we're good and ready. Things are going on. Plus, all sorts of things are happening that affect us, whether it's infectious disease or climate change or terrorists or proliferation. There's all sorts of economic issues. There's digital issues. And that's the difference, is Washington, in many ways, could try to say, hey, we need to focus here at home. We don't have that focus. We don't have that luxury. We've got to do both. We've got to, yes, repair the home front, put our house in order. Absolutely. But we've also got to deal with the world simultaneously. And I think that's, one way to understand both the similarities and the differences, because globalization now is a fundamental reality. Plus, you have all sorts of countries that have global reach. Again, technology has really changed the dynamics of history. Alliances for this president, unlike the previous one, unlike in some ways Mr. Washington, this president sees them as force multipliers. He sees them as necessary and desirable instruments for the United States dealing with the world, and he's right to see it that way. Allies are partners. They're like-minded. They bring certain capabilities. And there's nothing in the world the United States can do better by itself than it can do with its partners and allies. And that's true in the security domain. It's true in dealing with a rising China, a pugnacious Russia, or the full set of global issues. Now, translating that logic into specific actions and agreements, well, that's the stuff of foreign policy. And that will be the challenge for the new Secretary of State and others. But I think as a default option, as a way to approach the world with others, with partners, I think makes complete good sense.
So let's take up one example of a contentious relationship. In your book, you have this. You do this thing where you do a variety of areas: the Americas, Asia, Africa. But in one of your other sections, you talk about the relationship of the United States and China. And at one point, you say that there is the prospect of a new Cold War between the United States and China. Could you talk a little bit about if you think this Cold War might happen, and what it would mean if it does, and how similar or dissimilar would it be from the one we had with Russia?
Well, the good news is there's nothing inevitable. The bad news is it could happen. History is what we make it to be. And this will be the result of decisions made here in China and elsewhere. There's very little that's baked into the cake. The challenge is, and history suggests, there is a structural challenge between the existing great power of the day and a rising challenge. And the question is, can we accommodate China's emergence on the global stage? Can China rein in its actions to accept certain strictures or limits? So each country is going to have to make some enormous decisions. I don't much like the phrase, David, Cold War, a new Cold War, simply because in the Cold War, if you will, Cold War 1.0 with the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union was not integrated in the world economically. Soviet Union posed a military challenge, wanted to promote the spread of communism around the world, so there was an ideological dimension and so forth. China very much is an economic competitor, and it's everywhere. So the yardstick or the compass for American foreign policy during the Cold War, which was containment, much of that doesn't make sense because China's already there. It's already leapfrog. Indeed, we invited them in 20 years ago. So, and the whole idea, which hasn't quite panned out, is that their integration would bring about a mellowing of their behavior at home and abroad. And needless to say, that hasn't come to pass. So I think, the structural challenge now for American foreign policy is how do we push back against China where we must over what it does at home and abroad? How do we do it in a way that, one, hopefully does not lead to confrontation, and two, hopefully does not preclude the possibility that those aspects of our relations which are in our self-interest, it does not preclude them. So we'd like to have certain kinds of trade continue. We'd like to have China's help in dealing with the North Korea. We'd like to have China's help in dealing with infectious disease or climate change or Afghanistan. It's a long list of issues where what China does will have a big impact on regional and global results. So again, the challenge, can we have this multifaceted relationship where we push back where need be, particularly against China's muscular foreign policy in the South China Sea, its pressures on Taiwan. I think we're right to criticize its human rights behavior, its violation of its commitments in Hong Kong, its theft of intellectual property. It's a long list. But can we do these things again so it does not, one, lead to an overall confrontation, and two, it does not lead to a one-dimensional hostile relationship? I believe we can, but it will put a real premium on our diplomacy. And obviously, as the saying goes, it takes two to tango. So it will also very much be up to China.
One of the things that's come apparent in at least the news items about China in U.S. is that the Republican legislatures in Washington are pushing hard for Biden to continue to hold or continue to have the Trump approach to China because they feel that China is such a threat. How does Biden and his foreign policy administration wend their way through the shoals of that kind of relationship, given the importance of the relationship and the negatives that have occurred over the last couple of administrations?
Well, the first thing to say is there will be some similarities. There won't be anything like a total break between the foreign policy towards China of the past 4 years and the next 4 years. And I think this reflects a widespread change in American thinking about China, disillusionment with how it's come to use its greater economic and diplomatic and military might. And I think it reflects more than anything the reality of Xi Jinping's rule. It has become more repressive at home, more adventurous and muscular abroad. And economically, as I mentioned a minute ago, rather than integrating and playing the game, if you will, by the rules that were set up, China continues to act in ways that are very much in its narrow self-interest, but not in the interest of anybody else. So there's real disillusionment. And that's why I think there's more continuity than not between the two administrations. But there'll be significant departures. I think this administration will put certain limits on its goals. The previous Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, put a great deal of emphasis on trying to bring about a fundamental change in China, including the end of the Communist Party's domination and so forth. This administration is going to conduct a much more traditional foreign policy where it emphasizes what China does more than what China is. I think this administration is going to try to refine where it limits the flow of technology to China. I'm not sure, for example, that TikTok is a mortal threat to the future of the United States, but where they'll come out on that, I'm not sure. Again, it'll be somewhat restrictive, but the degree of it will, I think, be more narrow. You may have less symbolic poking of the tiger, or in terms of certain types of interactions with Taiwan. But what I'm hoping is you have more substantive help for Taiwan, where the United States moves closer so that China is not in a position to coerce or threaten, much less use military force against Taiwan. I think you'll probably see more diplomacy, not just the odd summit at the presidential level, but the normal stuff, strategic dialogue, regular interactions between officials on the two sides, and in an old-fashioned way, more of them conducted in private, less public name calling. So I think this will remain a difficult relationship, given our different interests, our different nature, and the rest. But I do think it's a relationship which could be managed successfully by diplomacy.
So at the end, we're going to take time and answer questions from the audience. But one of the things I like about Zoom is the audience actually is giving me questions all the way through, and so we can pick up things. And one of them from Jake Rotter is, can you explain the lasting impacts of the use of Section 232 by the last administration when it comes to China, and how it may impact future actions, both in the new administration and in the United States?
Remind me, Section 232 is the trade sanctions?
I presume, yeah.
Look, this administration is going to have to decide. It inherited a lot of sanctions vis-a-vis China. A lot of them were put on unilaterally outside the WTO. The question is whether they will be rolled back. I think they will at some point. The question is that they could prove difficult to roll back in isolation. And as a political matter, as a diplomatic matter, there may need to be a give and take rather than it look like a unilateral action on our part. But I don't think that at the end of the day constitutes the big issues with China, nor do I think what the last administration was obsessed with, which was the size of a trade imbalance, is particularly significant. I think the biggest single issue in the economic realm is going to be how we constrict technology flows, both flows to China and China's access to technology here. We're going to need to bring others on board. By others, I mean our partners and allies in Europe and Asia. We're going to need to do it more with a scalpel than with a sledgehammer. And we're not going to be able to go to these other countries and basically say, you're either with us or against us. They're not going to choose between the United States and China. So I think the only hope of working this out is to come up in consultation with them with a relatively narrow set of technologies that, if controlled, China would have a real impact on the pace of China's either its military development, its intelligence capabilities, or its ability to compete with us economically. And I think that will be, at least I'm hoping that's the focus. Let me say one more thing, since I mentioned the word compete, David. A big part of China policy is going to have nothing to do with China, with Section 232 or anything else. It's going to have to do with us. Can we make ourselves more competitive? If you don't like Chinese 5G, Huawei, okay, fine. Well, where's the American alternative? Well, there hasn't been one. What do we do about AI? What about robotics? And so forth. So a competitiveness policy turns out to be critical. It's everything from attracting and keeping the most talented people in the world here. China doesn't have an immigration policy. We do. That's one of our comparative advantages. China doesn't have allies, and we do. That's another competitive advantage. Can we make that work? Can we improve our schools, our infrastructure? The level of spending on basic research in recent years is only about half the post-World War II average. Will this administration and will Congress support essentially doubling the amount we spend on basic research? If all these things happen, we will become far more competitive. China will see that, and I believe that will ultimately is much more likely to lead China to rein in its behavior with the understanding that it's up against something it can't win.
We could spend a lot of time talking about that statement. It strikes me that it is a central issue, and you talk about this. Can America get its house in order to remain competitive, to be the leader that it has been for the last 75 or 100 years? And do you get a sense so far of the Biden administration's commitment or its ability to be able to move things forward?
Well, I think the area where they're focusing the most, where they have moved things forward, and they probably have the greatest capacity to, is on COVID. You know, when you buy a house, the real estate agent tells you there's 3 laws of real estate: location, location, location. I actually think when it comes to the Biden administration's agenda, there's 3 priorities: COVID, COVID, and COVID. We have got to get this right. Obviously, for the human reason, we've lost nearly 500,000 fellow Americans. We've also got to get it right so people can go back to school, so the economy grows again. We need none of that's going to happen. So I would say COVID is the single most pressing, not just public health priority, not just economic priority, but probably national security priority. If we get this right, it also sends the message to the world that the United States can be competent, and others will note that. So I would say focus on that, and I think if we do that, the economy will come back gangbusters. Indeed, I would predict in a year, the biggest question about the economy is going to be whether it's overheating, and about inflationary pressures, given what's going on. There's other things, though, we still have to really focus on domestically. One is going to be that even though jobs will come back, the same jobs won't come back. A lot of jobs have permanently disappeared. We need a much larger set of programs for reskilling, retraining workers, so they can continue to offer things that the workplace wants. We obviously need to improve infrastructure. We obviously need to deal with race and police behavior. We obviously need to deal with public schools, obviously need to deal with immigration. It's a long, long list of domestic issues, all of which, by the way, have international and national security consequences. But I would say at the moment, the single most fundamental is COVID. The good news is I think it's largely amenable to being addressed. What might end up being the most complicated of all the domestic issues is the question of our politics. And can we find our way back from the events, not just of January 6th, but the kinds of divisions that have characterized American domestic politics over recent years and even decades? Can we find a way to govern so we can address all those domestic and international challenges we face? That's not something that's easily done. It's not something that's done in a matter of months. The question is, over the course of years, can progress be made? And I think the jury's out on that.
I think I would agree completely. The jury is out about whether we can dial it back. There's lots of things in there that I want to talk about, but one more thing about China, which is not literally about China, and that is another one of our questionnaires, John Murray, asked, how will the Biden administration make or strengthen its relationship with Africa, especially African countries that have been securing financing for projects from China's Belts and Roads program that is now an international behemoth?
Look, it's important. And, for those who don't study Africa a lot, Africa is the one part of the world that over the next, 30, 40, 50 years, the lion's share of global population increase will be Africa. The challenges in Latin America, in Europe, in most of Asia will be aging populations.
Right.
In some cases, it'll be shrinking populations. Even South Asia, for the most part, will level off after another generation or so. Africa, there'll be another billion people in the course of the next generation or two. So the real question is, how does Africa get to a point where that is more of a blessing than a burden? And that's going to require much better governance. So one thing, both in part by the example we set, as well as what we do, it would be good to be a major proponent of good government, of non-corrupt government, of efficient and effective government. There's things we, again, do both by what we do here at home, as well as aid and so forth we send. Africans we let into the United States to study, to get skills, and then can return home is another way we can help. Trade, ways in which African goods can reach our markets. In some ways also our goods can reach theirs, in particular our technology. In the short run, we're going to have a major opportunity, David, which will be with dealing with the pandemic. I saw a few hours ago the administration, I believe correctly, announced a substantial U.S. contribution to Gavi and the global vaccine effort, COVAX, which I think is really good on every level. And we have other aid programs and trade mechanisms where we can essentially compete with China. And so we can compete with China by our example through our immigration policy, with trade, with investment, with aid. We just have to get on the dance floor. And in many ways, for the last few years, we've not been on the dance floor. So I'm not worried about our ability to compete with China or anybody else when we essentially put our minds to it.
It's interesting that Africa often is the forgotten part of the world with American foreign policy. You know, as we just saw with Abby's background, the Barbary Coast and the pirates of early America. It's been there for a long time, and one wonders, will it finally emerge as a place that we take as seriously as it might need, given that it's going to add 1 billion people?
It's one of those questions I don't know if anybody can answer. It obviously has great economic potential. The question is whether it's realized. A lot will depend upon Africans themselves. You can't generalize. You're talking about more than 50 countries.
Of course.
And my hunch is there'll be an incredibly large range of behavior, from the truly successful to the truly unsuccessful. And quality of government, of governance, of leadership will matter a great deal. A lot will depend upon two countries, Nigeria and South Africa, which have the potential to be anchors, but also have the potential to be anything but. And I think in a country like Nigeria, the weakness of national and central institutions is worrisome. One of our fellows, John Campbell, just brought out a really wise book about Nigeria. And essentially, it's about how most of the loyalties in Nigeria between citizens and state are not to the federal government and are not to Lagos. And the question then is, how does one have a truly functioning government country? And you've obviously got massive ethnic and religious challenges, in addition to corruption and other things. So I'd say one other thing. The real challenges of Africa, and the reason the answer to your question is probably not, is I don't think the fundamental dynamics of African history over the course of the century are going to be the stuff of geopolitics. I think it's really going to be the stuff. So it's not Nigeria's relationship with its neighbors or South Africa's with Zimbabwe in the sense of like it is in Europe or Asia. I'm not worried about wars between states. I'm worried about failed states. I'm worried about states that can't look out for their own people. You have then large refugee flows. I'm worried about the impact of climate change, which will exacerbate things. I think those are the questions of Africa. So my guess is it will not be like Asia, which I think will be the part of the world that really will write a lot of 21st century history. It's where the major powers are and will interact. I think Asia will be the defining region of this century, in some ways the way Europe was in the previous century. With 2 world wars and a Cold War, Europe was the principal venue of 20th century history. My guess is the Asia Pacific, from India through China, Japan, what have you, Russia, United States is a Pacific country with alliances, entangling alliances, will be heavily involved there. And the question is, and this is where the people are, it's where the wealth is, it's where there's growing military might, there's dozens of border and territorial and sea-based disputes. So the question is, can Asia, which has been the most successful part of the world really for decades, phenomenal economic growth, stability for the most part within states and between them, can this continue? And I can articulate the question more than I can, give you the answer. But I think that will be the principal region of the world, more than Africa, more than Latin America, more than the Middle East, which has preoccupied us for the last couple of decades, and even more than Europe.
Does that mean North Korea is, even though it's a small player in that global drama, remains an important element of it? Could it be the moment that, or the place that the moment occurs that just throws the whole world into a imbalance?
Well, I can devise certain daisy chain scenarios, but look, I think North Korea is a real challenge in a couple ways. One is its growing nuclear and long-range missile force. Second of all, people don't talk about it, but its conventional military capabilities are still quite pronounced and are a threat to South Korea and the American forces that are on the 38th parallel. And then there's North Korea's internal situation. It's a black box. It's hard to read. And the question is whether at some point there's instability or not. And if there is a breakdown in order in North Korea, or if whatever the series of events is that leads to questions, then it's a real challenge for the United States and China to manage it. The time the United States and China came to blows, most Americans have forgotten this, was in the Korean War in the early 1950s, when American forces went north of the 38th parallel, went up to the Yalu River, and hundreds of thousands of quote unquote Chinese volunteers came across the border. And several years later, tens of thousands of Americans died, far more than that died on the Chinese and Korean side, and we were back to the 38th parallel. And so the challenge for Korea scenarios is can this be worked out, particularly at a moment of crisis? It's one of the most sensitive questions out there involving South Korea, North Korea, Japan, China, and the United States, Russia. So this is there's a field, if you sometimes describe as preventive diplomacy, but this is a good example where it's needed. You don't want to wait until the day of a crisis before you start thinking about some of these issues.
So so one of our questioners, Hugo, says you wrote a book on economic sanctions and foreign policy. Not only is this about North Korea, not only about relationships with China, but also if we can move to Iran, Syria, and Russia and the relationships there. What improvements could we make in the way that we do sanctions, and what do you think the future is for sanctions?
My own view is we use them too often. Henry Kissinger once wrote that the average State Department memo has three options: unilateral surrender, all-out nuclear war, or the wise middle course. And there's a little bit of that when it comes to sanctions. Option one is do nothing. Option three is go to war. And then option two, the compromise option, is sanctions. So right now, there's more sanctions in place against more targets, countries and other, than there's ever been. My own sense is, I haven't studied it for a few years, but when I did study it, I couldn't find very many cases, to say the least, where sanctions could accomplish big things. Most countries are prepared to incur a price, particularly when the sanctions are unilaterally imposed by the United States. So we sanction Russia over Ukraine. Okay, well, the Russians say Crimea is important enough to us, Eastern Ukraine is important enough to us, we'll pay the price. If we sanction China over Hong Kong, Xi Jinping will shrug and say, it's a price well worth paying. In some cases, sanctions also can be counterproductive. They can strengthen the ability of an authoritarian government to control the marketplace, which is the last thing we want. There can be collateral damage. You want to aim sanctions at, say, leaders, but often they can get the black market to work for them. You often heard of broader society. Over time, their effect can get diluted. There's also a bit of a backlash against American sanctions. Some of our more targeted financial sanctions may well accelerate the emergence of alternatives to the dollar's role as the reserve currency in the world. So my own sense is we overuse them, sometimes abuse them, and we ought to think a lot harder about whether they will achieve more good than not. We ought to review them regularly. Just because we put a sanction on a year ago doesn't mean it's still the greatest policy. And we ought to weigh it against other options. I think it's become a little bit too much of a reflex foreign policy tool for us. It tends to be the don't just stand there, do something, but don't do too much. My own view is we ask way too much of sanctions.
Is there a policy option that comes to mind that would replace some of those sanctions? In some cases it may make sense, particularly where you can get multilateral support. I'm a much bigger fan of multilateral sanctions. I like
if you are going to use them, I like them when they're more targeted. In some cases, it may be public diplomacy, maybe private diplomacy. It may be something on the internet. It may be something with military force, and military force represents a great range of options. There's things we can do to strengthen friends. So look, you've got the entire foreign policy toolkit. And I would simply say sanctions are one tool in that kit, one instrument, can be the best. But my sense is we look to them to do too much too often.
So let's stay in that area. One of the questioners asked about our relationship with Europe. Now, in your book, you suggest that Europe of 50 years ago isn't going to be Europe of 50 years from now. And you've already alluded to the European century and the Asian century. And yet it remains, as you point out in the book, the second largest, I think, economy in the world, and an incredibly powerful economic, social, cultural force in the world. How do we interact and make sure that Europe stays strong? And I know, it's not our job, but at the same time.
Look, Europe is, when I say Asia is going to be the most critical region of the 21st century, it doesn't mean that Europe is unimportant. And as you say, it represents about a fifth, depending upon how you count it, maybe slightly more of the world's GDP. Two of the great accomplishments of post-World War II statecraft were NATO, which kept the peace during the Cold War and since, for the most part in Europe. And the what began as the coal and steel community became the European community, now is the European Union, which has knitted together Europe in ways that war between or among its members is unthinkable. By the way, the war between them did dominate the first half of the 20th century and the preceding centuries. And it's also brought about extraordinary economic success, and democracies have been quite robust. So I think Europe still matters, and it's still an extraordinary part of the world. My own view is, though, that there's a tension between the role of countries in the European Union. We've just had the example of Brexit. I don't know if others at some point are going to leave. I'm hoping the painful example of Brexit will discourage others from doing so. Yeah. But how you resolve this question of the balance of power between capitals and Brussels is in some ways a permanent question. You've got real domestic challenges in Europe. I think the biggest issues in Europe right now might be internal. The future of the French government, where you have the rise of the far right challenging Mr. Macron. What happens in Germany now that Chancellor Merkel is stepping out? We just got a new Italian government. We'll see how that works. So there's the rise of illiberalism in places like Poland and Hungary. So Europe is, you've got domestic challenges as well as the challenges between countries and the EU. You've got the external challenge of Russia. So I think the answer is the United States should stay involved. I think NATO makes great sense. One of the differences, and I think corrections of the Biden administration over the Trump administration, gets back to your first question, will be to see alliances as valuable rather than as simply countries to beat up on. And by the way, Europeans spend a lot on defense. I would spend much more time focusing on how they spend that money, not how much they spend. For the same amount of money, they could have much more defense if it were truly integrated. So we ought to be focusing on that. We ought to look at coming up with if we can, a somewhat common policy towards China. The fact that the Europeans marched off on their own a few months ago was not welcome, but I don't think all is lost. Obviously, there's a reason to try to come up with a common policy towards Mr. Putin and Russia. There's Mediterranean issues. There's the problem of Turkey. I mean, it's a large agenda. So it's still important. I just don't see. I see it though slightly more inward looking. Its ability to project power to other parts of the world beyond parts of the Middle East is quite limited. So I just don't see it as central to American foreign policy. But I'd say one other thing, Europeans could be excellent partners of the United States when it comes to coming up with new arrangements to deal with globalization. You want to think about climate change or the internet or whatever, or reform of the World Health Organization. Well, Europe's a good place to start. I once described Europe as a pool of partners. that tends to be more like-minded than any other. And I think that's probably still true for all of our differences. And so I would make a run at doing those things. I think one of the biggest problems with Europe, by the way, is going to be European doubts about us. I should have a nickel for every European, or euro or whatever, for every European who's recently raised me the question of what's the exception and what's the norm? Is Mr. Biden being in power, is that return to normal, or is that simply an exception? And after 4 years of Biden, the United States will then return to a form of Trumpism. And that's corrosive for the US-European, the transatlantic relationship, because it sows doubts about the wisdom of their dependency on us. So my own hunch is that some issues of US-European relations will not be worked out until the Europeans get a better sense of what the future of the Republican Party is. And since they assume there'll be what you call rotation of power between Democrats and Republicans, they want to know what will be the nature of, in particular, the future of the Republican Party, to some extent, the future of the Democratic Party. There's concerns about American domestic politics.
I was curious. You're in touch with lots and lots and lots of people. January 6th, the insurrection, the impeachment trial that followed and was part of that. What is the impact of this somewhat chaotic set of episodes on the U.S.'s position in the world, and how long does it take for this to shift?
Look, it was damaging in the extreme. It didn't come out of a vacuum. Europeans and others have looked at everything from our opioid problems to our gun, what they see as a gun culture and the violence there, to race issues. They saw what happened after George Floyd was killed. They saw Charlottesville, and so on. So there's large aspects of American society that they feel alienated from. Some of them would add capital punishment to that. So it's a long list of things that divide us from, we're different. So there's some doubts about us. And I think what January 6th did was brought them into sharp relief. And it also raised fundamental questions for a lot of people in Europe and around the world. To put it bluntly, something's gone wrong in the United States. How could this happen? This is not the United States they recognize. This is not the United States that in any way is familiar to them. This applies to people who came here to study or came here as tourists or business people. So there's a sense that something is going seriously wrong here. And the question is, can we fix it? COVID plays into that as well. So as I said before, I think a demonstration of competence and progress on COVID would help. That would lead to a progress on the economy. And then other signs that the United States is willing and able to deal with some of what its domestic challenges, I think would go some ways towards reassuring others. And the reassurance is important. These are countries that have essentially put their security eggs in our basket. And if they lose confidence in us, and if they basically come to conclude we're no longer trustworthy, we're no longer predictable, we're too divided, I think it has real implications. I think they might then be much more likely to appease a more powerful neighbor. They might be more likely in some cases to develop nuclear weapons of their own in parts of Asia, if they thought the United States was not dependable. Our ability to promote democracy in markets would plummet. So what happens here matters a great deal. So yes, I think January 6th was a major loss of standing. And the thing that you probably tell your students is it takes a lifetime to build a reputation, but you can an afternoon to burn it. Well, we did a lot of burning on January 6th. So it's a slow road back. We can get back. There's not very little that's permanent in history, but it will take a lot of signs and works that demonstrate that was the exception rather than the new norm.
And I wonder if it empowered or gave some benefit to the Putins of the world. And particularly, how does the Biden administration overcome that loss of credibility, if you will, in trying to deal with Russia and others?
Well, I think for authoritarians, it had two effects. One was it suggested we're weaker and more divided than they had thought. And what worries me is whether this might lead them to act with a greater sense of adventure, that we're distracted and divided. The other is it gave them a pass. I mean, Chinese media would literally show signs of what was going on in the United States and basically say, that's why we want no part of democracy here. Democracy is disorderly, it's dangerous, it can't provide, the basic security that people need. We can do that, Chinese people. Therefore, what we have is much better than what those Americans have. A little bit of some of the reaction you saw around the world when the Arab Spring went bad. Right. And it gave authoritarians a certain lease on life. So look, no good came of this. No good. And again, it unnerved our allies. So it both, I think, gave a pass to authoritarians. I'm hoping it didn't make them more adventuresome. We'll find out. And it clearly unnerved our allies. So it'll take us quite a while to climb back up. We can get there, but it will take time.
So we're getting near the end, and we have a question about that from someone asking about our relationship with Russia and how, especially, for example, around the Ukraine, NATO, and Syria. I was wondering if you could pick one of those or two of those and talk about what do you think is going to happen in places like the Middle East. Obviously, is a complicated place, and the Ukraine clearly is still a touchstone.
Yeah, well, I'd look in general with Russia. Let's make one large point, which is this is going to be a very difficult relationship. Mr. Putin gets up in the morning and sees what we stand for, what we try to do as antithetical to his personal and what he sees as his country's interests. He sees the rule of law, Western liberalism as a threat. The challenge for us is going to be somewhat akin to the challenge I depicted with China. How do we push back against all the things that give us real pause with Mr. Putin, including his rather violent use of force in the Middle East, what he's doing in Georgia and Ukraine, his attempt to kill his political opponents and so forth? How do we push back in a way that we still preserve areas of cooperation? Well, we succeeded in one a few weeks ago, which was nailing down the extension of the nuclear arms control arrangement, the so-called New START agreement. That was, to me, a positive sign. The question is, could we possibly enlist Russian help on Iran? Maybe. The Russians don't want to see Iran with a nuclear weapon, as I understand their policy. Ukraine's going to be brutally tough. The Crimea conquest, as the Russians, occupation, whatever word you want to use, we're right not to in any way accept it, acknowledge it, legitimize it. But I see zero signs anytime soon, and even longer, the Russians are going to give it back. It's wildly popular in Russia. Eastern Ukraine, I think it's hard to shoehorn the Russians out of, in large part that they've so disrupted things. I think Putin's worried that if he were ever to leave, there'd be reprisals against the ethnic Russians, and that would be a political disaster for him. So I just think this remains a really difficult, uneasy relationship for the most part in places like Syria and elsewhere. And it's one of those dispiriting facts of the world. But I don't see that change. To me, the real question ultimately, David, it's not one that's talked about a lot, is what happens after Putin. And I don't know how long Mr. Putin rules. He now wants to rule to at least, 2036, if my memory serves me right.
Yep.
Job security. But at some point, even Putin will go. Whether he dies. Bob Gates, the former Secretary of Defense and CIA head, used to say that Putin, will have to be carried out of the Kremlin feet first. Okay, that may well be. But then what happens then? He has basically overseen what you might call a kleptocracy. Power and wealth have been incredibly concentrated in the hands of the few. There's really very little in the way of a real economy, very little in the way of real politics. There's no real concept of legitimacy. So what happens after Mr. Putin? And I don't think anybody can predict with confidence what is the transition. I'd be very surprised if it were peaceful. I'd be very surprised if it were orderly or neat. It's almost certain to be contested. I don't know what the morning after or the year after or the era after Mr. Putin looks like, because he's done very little to institutionalize
Right.
anything in Russia.
Yeah, you wonder if he's being carried out feet first because he died of natural causes or others, um, as it goes on. Let's to end it. Let's bring it back a little home. And you have a nice little piece on NAFTA in your book. It was a nice map. It really explores and explains NAFTA really well. Mexico, our relationship with Mexico has been fraught for a long time, since at least the 1840s, and remains fraught. What do you see is the future of the economic? Richard Kipling asks, what's the future of that economic relations between the two countries? And what about the immigrant issue from Mexico?
I don't know if it's a word I expect it is not. Could it get fraughter? Probably. I think, though, it's largely because of the current leadership of Mexico. I don't think there's anything structural. Until the current leader of Mexico, if you think about it, Mexico had realized significant progress over the last couple of decades. You had the rotation of political power. Mexico became a real democracy. You had NAFTA. Now we have the USMCA. We had cooperation and limited cooperation in the security realm and so forth. It was pretty good. The question is now whether it continues or grows. You've got the economic framework, but it's not obvious to me you're going to have the cooperation that you had around the border. You're having growing signs of illiberalism in Mexico. You still have enormous problems of governance. Mexico's a weak state. Lack of police capacity. The judicial system is really poor. The penal system is awful. So there's real inequality geographically between North and South and so forth. So Mexico faces enormous challenges. For historical reasons, we're probably not the best partner. What we did in Colombia is not going to be replicable, shall we say, in Mexico. And so I think, I'm less optimistic than I was. Now, I've now told you more than I know about Mexico. I expect many people on the Zoom know more about it than I do. One of my colleagues, Shannon O'Neill, is one of the country's real experts on it. But I'm less confident than it was. But I still see the potential if we can get through these next few years, because it makes so much sense for both countries, along with Canada, to do certain things together, whether it's dealing with security, dealing with health challenges, and the like. Whether they'll be able to do that, I simply don't know.
So let's end with this question. If you were to give Joe Biden three pieces of advice, what would those be?
Well, one I've already mentioned, which is for the first year, I think COVID ought to be the overwhelming party. It won't be eradicated, but if we get it mostly right, mostly under control, that will be an enormous accomplishment, both in terms of preserving life, normalizing the society, and getting people back to work. So I would say that has got to be priority number one. I would also, in foreign policy, obviously you want to focus on two sets of issues. One is China, to try to invest in this relationship and spend the time with a real dialogue with China to try to shape Chinese behavior, not change its nature, shape its behavior. And then begin to tackle some global issues. And a lot of, then you've got everything from climate to public health to the internet, but global challenges have got to be at the center of American foreign policy. And we've got to try to build some consensus around the world what to do. Those are three things, last again, but and he would agree with this, there's things on the home front, and to begin to heal some of our political divisions. And that's a long-term process. But, the Oval Office is many things. One of the things the Oval Office is a classroom. It's a great way to reach out to the American people. So some of what you do in the Oval Office is you govern, if you will, in the Washington, D.C. sense. And you deal with legislation, and it's technical in terms of reconciliation and amendments and all these things. But there's another part to the Oval Office, which is to use it as a classroom. to talk to the American people and to try to change some attitudes and some thinking. And you're not going to convince a lot of people, but there also are a lot of people you could convince. So I would hope that the president would give himself 4 years to chip away at some of the divide within this country, which is truly corrosive, and which I would argue, poses more of a threat to what we're talking about here, to our ability to be effective in the world, and poses more of a threat to our own cohesion as a society, as a functioning democracy, than many of us realized, certainly before January 6th. So I would make that I would return to those issues more frequently than I would have thought necessary a year ago.
It certainly seems a remarkable shift, and so quickly and so dramatically, even though it's been coming for a very long time. Richard Haass, thank you very much for being with us and having such a spirited conversation. To all of those who asked questions that I didn't get to, I apologize, but there's just only so much time in these events. And I tried to get to as many as I could. From us at USC Price and from our wonderful partners at Mount Vernon, we wish you a good night.